Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming, to all of you in the room and also to those of us who are joining us online via YouTube. My name is Karen Buchanan. I'm curator at the Arctic Convoy Museum, and we're delighted to be joined this evening by Dr Roddy Maclean. Roddy grew up in Glasgow, but his family are from the Isle of Skye. He grew up speaking Gaelic, and he now lives with his wife Morag on Lewis for the last 40 years. And Roddy is here with us this evening to launch the English version of his book, in English, Never to Return. The Gaelic version, which came out in 2023, I think, Roddy, was called Cha Till Mise, and was shortlisted for the Saltire Society Award for Book of the Year and also for the Donald Meek Award for Best Non-Fiction Book. So it's been really well received. And no doubt this English version will help it reach an even broader audience. So Roddy's going to talk us through some of the themes in the book this evening. He'll probably talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have some questions and answers at the end. If you're joining us remotely and would like to ask Roddy a question, please just write that in the comments on YouTube and we'll pick that up at the end. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Roddy. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Karen. I'll just take this out. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming out to the launch of Never to Return. And I'll give you an overview of the book before we go into some detail. It looks in general at the Russian convoys and in particular on one Royal Navy destroyer, HMS Achates, which was sunk on the 31st of December 1942. And I look in particular at HMS Achates because my mother's cousin was lost in that boat at the age of 22. And also subsequent to finding out a little bit more about my mother's cousin's experience on Russian convoys, I found out that a neighbour not far from me in Lewis had also lost his father on the same boat in the same battle on the 31st of December 1942, and he was just 1 year old when he lost his father. So I follow these two people as well as some others which we'll mention in a second. I should say that David MacDonald was from Waternish in the Isle of Skye, and Kenneth McKeever was from Habast Nest in the Isle of Lewis. So we're keeping the balance between Skye and Lewis. And also I've always wanted to know what it would have been like to go on a Russian convoy, and I've tried in the book to answer that question as best I can to let people know. It was my own interest, but I know that other people are interested in the Russian convoys, and I try to follow HMS Achates, especially in Convoy JW51B, her last convoy on the Russian run. So I'll be doing some excerpts from the book. I think we can ask the question at the beginning, what is a convoy? It's very simple. It's a group of ships sailing together for protection, and it's nothing new to World War II. World War I had it. The British government had convoys. Troop ships were protected. Merchant ships bringing necessary food items and other equipment were protected by the Royal Navy. And if we go back to the 16th to the 18th century, Spain had convoys when they sent large fleets protected by their own navy to the Americas to take all the plunder, the gold and the silver that they robbed others of. They were prime prey for pirates such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, who were more or less, they were given permission by the sovereign to attack these Spanish vessels. So they sailed in convoys. They say between 30 to 90 ships sailed together about twice a year. And we can also talk about why the Russian convoys started. Sorry, I've jumped. There it's jumping a wee bit. Yeah. Well, they started because of Hitler's betrayal of Stalin. In 1939, a non-aggression pact was signed between Russia and Germany, and they both agreed that they would share the land between their borders, and that meant Germany was going to get the western part of Poland and Russia could take the eastern part. That was the main thrust of it. But in June 1941, Hitler amassed 3 million soldiers as an invasion force to enter into Russia. That was a massive amount of military. When you consider that on D-Day, the Allied forces consisted of 156,000 soldiers. So 3 million. Stalin was horrified. He'd been betrayed. He needed help. And so he asked Winston Churchill, British government, if they could help. Churchill, being the statesman that he was, saw that it would help Britain's cause if he gave supplies to Russia to keep them fighting on the Eastern Front and use up Hitler's valuable military resources there and not have them on the western side of Europe and perhaps make an invasion easier. So one of the first things that Stalin asked was the bombing of German occupied Norway, the airfields they had taken over, because Germany was attacking Russia from these airfields, which at times were only about 100 miles away from Russia. And I'm going to read a little bit about what happened to HMS Achates on one of the initial assistances that the British government gave to Russia. So this is from the book. The destroyer HMS Achates was to form part of the defensive screen for the two aircraft carriers Victorious and Furious. However, on 25th July 1941, 5 days before the attack, as the vessels gathered off the coast of Iceland at 0300, HMS Achates collided with a mine and her bow was ripped open. Worse still, 65 crew who had been in their sleeping quarters in the forward area lost their lives. Ronald Wayman was a navigator on the Achates at the time, and this is how he described events. The captain appeared beside me, scratching his straggly beard. He peered over my shoulder at the chart. "What do you think, Way?" he said. "According to the Admiral's calculations at noon, sir, he says we are here," I replied, indicating a penciled position on the chart near the coast of Iceland. Present course and speed is calculated to bring us close to the minefield at 0300. We are to skirt the minefield here. I shifted the pencil to a point along our projected course. I descended from the bridge and made my way in the dark through the familiar, orderly clutter of the upper deck. The steel door creaked under my hand. I closed it and switched on the light. My little cabin was a haven in which the ever-present roar of the sea and the buffeting of the wind were reduced to a murmur. I brushed my teeth, climbed into my bunk, switched off the light and the radio, and to the gentle movement of the sea and the subdued throb of the engines, I fell asleep. It seemed moments later there was a vast explosion. I was flung out of my bunk, moving so swiftly that my beautiful radio gramophone, dislodged by the impact, fell on my bunk where a second before my head had rested. I was already in my clothes, lacking only sea boots. Around my chest, deflated, was the inseparable May West. I thrust my feet into the boots, pulled on my cap and made for the door. The ship was curiously quiet. The engines had stopped. The deck under my feet was slanting in a peculiar manner. The heavy latch on the door was stiff, and in the dark I wrestled with it. It gave under my effort, and I burst out, only to recoil with shock. Virtually everything forward of my cabin, the entire forecastle, had disappeared. Before me there was empty, vertiginous space. Below me, the sea humped, dark and oil-slicked. From a ripped and ragged piece of shattered bulkhead fluttered the remnants of a hammock, torn and bloody. There was an acrid smell of burnt cordite in the air. Strangely, I was alone. I turned and in the darkness picked my way to the wheelhouse, the deck slanting under my feet. Cole Hamilton, who had taken over from me earlier as officer of the watch, was struggling with the ship's wheel. At his feet lay the helmsman, unconscious, bleeding from the mouth. "See the captain on the bridge," said Cole Hamilton. I went up top. The captain was speaking with quiet authority into the engine room voice pipe. The crisp voice of our Welsh engineer officer came back reassuringly. I glanced around the dark horizon. It was empty. The chief engineer appeared. He was covered with oil, wiping his hands on a piece of cotton waste. "I can give you 2 knots, Captain, going astern." And so the damage was extensive to HMS Achates, as was mentioned there. Her bow section was completely blown away, and that's why she had to be towed backwards. It was touch and go whether they were actually going to repair her or not, but the Admiralty decided it was worth repairing, and she was going to be towed back from Iceland, where some emergency repairs had been made to fix splits in the bow and strengthen bulkheads. And she was on her way to the Swan Hunter shipyard on the Tyne. But on the way, a storm blew up and the splits appeared again, and they diverted to the Faroe Islands. And I just found this picture last year from the Faroes Islands War Museum, and this was HMS Achates coming in to the Navy base in Skallafjord in the Faroe Islands. The recovery tug HMRT Assurance towing her. She's being towed backwards. And so she was out of commission for about 9 months or so, and when she was recommissioned, she had some major improvements made to her. You can see there that the radar is pointed out, that there's the Type 271 surface detection radar, which was very accurate and could, much improved radar. It could detect a U-boat at 3 miles, and it could detect a U-boat periscope at 900 yards. And also it had its A gun removed and replaced by a head-thrown weapon, also known as a hedgehog, an anti-submarine device which looked like this. There were 24 spigot mortars on it, and when they fired in a pattern which would straddle where a U-boat was supposed to be. And this was a photo of an actual firing of one of these hedgehogs. There are 7 which have hit the water, and there should have been 17 in the air. I haven't quite managed to detect all 17 in the air, but there's quite a number there. So it was ready for joining the escort forces again after being refitted. Also, it received a new crew. A lot of new recruits from Chatham in Kent were to go on HMS Achates, as well as seasoned and experienced officers and seamen. And we'll come back to HMS Achates in a moment. Also, the question can be asked, why was Loch Ewe first choice as a convoy gathering point? And we'll read some more extracts from the book just to explain why Loch Ewe became so important during the Second World War. There you can see an aerial picture of the wooden huts and missing huts near the pier. Loch Ewe is in the northwest coast of Scotland and about 150 miles north of Caerloch-Lachalsh, about 50 miles north of Caerloch-Lachalsh and some 80 miles west of Inverness. It was chosen carefully by the Royal Navy as the main military base for convoys, following the devastating loss of the battleship HMS Royal Oak in Scapa Flow on the night of 13-14 December 1939. On that night, the German submarine U-47 slipped the defences in Orkney and succeeded in sinking the battleship with the loss of 834 lives. After the U-47 attack, the Royal Navy concluded that they had to find a safer anchorage for Merchant Navy and Royal Navy ships. In February 1941, Loch Ewe was chosen. As a deep sea loch with unhindered access to the North Atlantic, its location was very suitable. The River Clyde was too far away from Russia and the North Sea. Invergordon and Rosyth were open to air attacks and U-boat strikes. And although Scapa Flow defences were being improved, it was nowhere near being ready. Loch Ewe was available and very suitable. It provided shelter from westerly gales. It was 3 miles wide and 5 miles long, amply large for convoys to use it as a gathering place and anchorage. At the mouth of the loch, anti-submarine defences were installed, boom nets, a controlled minefield and anti-submarine indicator loops. At 14:15 on the afternoon of Tuesday 22nd December, Convoy JW51B, comprising 15 merchant vessels, it was reduced to 14 because one ship had to turn back later, was preparing for the long journey to Murmansk. Their load included 2,046 vehicles, 202 tanks, 87 planes, 33 bombers, 11,500 tonnes of fuel for motor vehicles, 12,650 tonnes of aviation fuel, and 54,321 tonnes of mixed cargo. So that was the importance of Loch Ewe, a very safe place for convoys to gather. Now, the next two gentlemen were very important persons in a convoy. We've got on my right, Commodore Robin Aveline Melhuish, and then Royal Navy Commander Robert St Vincent Sherbrooke. And the picture we saw before with the huts and the Nissen huts, in one of these wooden huts, these two people would address all the captains in the convoy and explain what their tactics would be if the enemy attacked. And we can read a little bit about the role of a Commodore from the book. I should say that Robin Aveline Melhuish was a very experienced seaman. He had spent a lot of his life in the Indian Ocean, charting and surveying. He was excellent at that, and it would be quite a contrast for him to start journeys to the Arctic and the cold, but he was an excellent Commodore. And the Royal Navy Commander Robert St Vincent Sherbrooke, you'll notice St Vincent in his name. That's because his forebears were involved just before Nelson came to greater prominence in the Battle of Cape St Vincent, and they had a very proud tradition, and he was actually awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions in the Battle of the Barents Sea, which we'll hear about later. So let's read some information about Commodores. This is from Chapter 8 called Convoy Commodores. Amongst the 181 Commodores in charge of merchant shipping in ocean convoys, North Atlantic, Arctic and other areas, there were 11 admirals, 33 vice admirals, 53 rear admirals and 13 captains. No matter the rank which they had attained before the war, in convoy duty they were all titled Commodores Royal Naval Reserve and were subservient to the Royal Navy's escort force commander. The Commodore was supported by his own signal unit from the Royal Navy, usually a signals petty officer, yeoman of signals, and 2 or 3 signallers. They would use Aldous lamps, semaphore flags and telescopes to transmit and receive messages, essential when strict radio silence had to be maintained. Code books were kept in a weighted bag to ensure they sank if thrown overboard in an emergency. 78 convoys sailed to the Arctic between August 1941 and May 1945, a journey which was laden with peril. The distance between Iceland and the ports in North Russia was 2,000 miles in the winter and 2,300 miles in the summer. In the summer, the convoys could follow a safer but longer course because the ice would be further north. There was almost 24 hours of continuous daylight in summer, and this gave the enemy greater opportunity to attack a convoy. For 1,400 miles of the journey, there was the danger of air attack. For 2,000 miles of the journey, there was a danger of enemy surface vessel attack. And for every mile of the journey, there was a danger of U-boats. Understandably, because of the longer daylight hours, the stress on crews during the summer months was more acute. In winter, twilight conditions prevailed between 0800 and 1500, which shortened the period for enemy attack. However, low temperatures, reaching down to minus 20 degrees, presented separate hardship for the crews. The burden of convoy protection fell to the Royal Navy. Frequently, there were more Royal Navy vessels in a convoy than merchant vessels, and though the convoy did not see them very often, submarines supported the surface vessels. If the Royal Navy commander's convoy protection role was challenging, so also was the task of the convoy commodore, who had to ensure the merchant vessels sailed safely in company, like whales enjoying the collective strength and vigilance the pod affords. So these were 2 important people in a convoy and carried out their tasks admirably. We'll move on now to speak about David MacDonald from Waternish in the Isle of Skye. This is a picture of David. He's in the middle there between his father and his mother. His father was my granduncle. David was my mother's cousin. And David was a boy who enjoyed croft work. He was recognised as being a very popular boy in school. Indeed, he got a prize from the local school for being the most popular and pleasant, well-mannered boy in the school, something that was borne out by his sailors, his comrades on the Achates as well. And it was through David really that I started my interest in the convoys, because on New Year's Eve when I was growing up in my teens, my mother would say, David was lost on the Russian convoys, and that was all. And it was as if she was honouring his memory, and on such a night when there was going to be a lot of celebrations, I think she felt it was suitable that she should just mention his name and keep him in memory. And we can fast forward to 2012 or so, when I went to see my cousin Davina Matthews, who had actually been brought up in Waternish and David was the uncle she had never seen. And I think the conversation about the convoy started because she was going to try and get the Arctic Star for David, which was being offered at that time. And I told her about what my mother said, and all she knew was that David was a radar operator on HMS Achates, and that he had been lost in the Battle of the Barents Sea. And that's all the family knew really about his demise. And she had been trying for 50 to 60 years at that point to try and find out what had happened to David. And it was only, well, that started my interest in the convoys, and I said, well, let's see what we can find out. So I went on to Royal Navy forums, and I came across this mailing by the Bean family in London. And they said that their father had been a radar operator on HMS Achates, that he had been wounded in the Battle of the Barents Sea on 31st December 1942, and that he had come out alive. And I knew from research and from speaking to the boys subsequently, David and Jim Bean, that there were 3 operators, radar operators on HMS Achates. We also found out that their father had told them that the Admiral Hipper had fired a shell about 11:15 on the 31st of December 1942. He said it killed the man to his left, Ivor Rowe from Manchester. He had a serious blow to the head, and it killed the man to the right of him, which would have been David. He had a severe and fatal stomach wound, and Fred Bean himself had been injured in the back with shrapnel, and he had to have that wound treated for the rest of his life. So we found out by that simple search what happened to David, and my cousin Davina was delighted. She was named after David. After all these years, we found someone who knew and was right beside David when he had been killed. This was David on his first day of training at Chatham, and possibly in June 1941, and he, as we mentioned, he was trained as a radar operator. It was a new and highly secret invention, and it's amazing how you can make contacts, because there was a lad from Lewis whose father had been a radar operator on HMS Sheffield, and he told me that there were snoopers on board HMS Sheffield, and they would go around the crew asking, did so-and-so say anything about the job he's doing? And they would say no, but if they had said yes, it would have, this was Andrew McKeever, he said if they had said yes, his father would have been in deep trouble, because I understand they had to sign the Official Secrets Act that they would not divulge anything about the work they were doing. So it was highly secretive work. And there was another connection in the Isle of Lewis where we got some more information about radar operators. So David had experienced a number of convoys. He'd also been involved in Operation Torch in North Africa in the Achates, where they landed troops to try and attack the Germans from another angle. And we've also got the last letter that he wrote. This was on the 20th of December 1942, before the ship left, HMS Achates left on Convoy JW51B. It didn't go to Loch Ewe, it went straight to Sadishfjord to be refueled, and then to join Convoy JW51B off the east coast of Iceland. And I'll see if I can read the letter to you and explain one or two things in it. Dear Mother, just a few lines in a hurry to let you know I'm well. Hoping you are the same. I'm sure you are hearing from Mary. That's why I wasn't writing so often. Mary was his sister. I think this will be my last letter for a while, so you can still write as usual. I hope you are hearing from John. Now, John was David's brother, and he had been shell-shocked on the Esperance Bay, and my mother knew about John, and she said in Gaelic to me, "Huret Drunach Wamasach," he got a terrible battering. They were attacked by German aircraft, and he was actually institutionalized for the rest of his life. He never recovered from his shell shock. And that he is doing all right. I met him once or twice, a very gentle, self-effacing man, and it was very sad indeed what happened to him. I hope you managed to get the corn stack in okay. Now, David's mother had lost her husband the year before. She now had one son who was shell-shocked and institutionalised and couldn't help in the croft. She also ran the local post office, which was a very important task during the Second World War, because telegrams and messages would come about those who were in the armed forces. Indeed, one councillor saw her plight and applied to get special dispensation for David so that he wouldn't go to war and he could stay and help his mother at home, run the post office and the croft and so on, but that wasn't accepted, so that's, he ended up going for training in Chatham. I'll have to close now for want of news. If Mary will get married before I come back, send her £1 from me as a present. Cheerio, meantime, David. Yes, well, his sister did get married in February, about a month or two after he was lost, and it was a very sober affair. My mother had to step in as a bridesmaid because Mary's other sister had to stay at home and look after the bereaved mother. Now, I mentioned Kenneth McKeever from Lewis, and this is Kenneth McKeever, and his son John was very helpful in giving me photographs and information about his father. And Kenneth lived just across the loch from me in Back. He was from Ness originally and married in Back. And he went down with the boat whilst helping others. He was mentioned in dispatches. He got the oak leaf for his bravery. And like a lot of other people, Kenneth McKeever had forebodings about this convoy JW51B. And we can read a little bit about that and about someone else who had forebodings too. So this is Kenneth McKeever. But first of all, there's a George Charlton, and I'm just putting him in because he had similar forebodings. Here is how George Charlton, another rating on the Achates, put it. Having already done 2 convoys to Russia, I did not relish another. I had leave and told my parents about my forebodings, which were that something awful was going to happen, but not to the extent that we were soon to experience. I did not think we would get away with it 3 times running. After the hammering we had on PQ18, our luck could not be that good. It must run out sometime. Kenneth McKeever, on leave in the Isle of Lewis, felt the same. His sense of foreboding was so strong that he left his wife and his young son a day earlier than he had to in order to meet Mary, his wife's sister, in Edinburgh. They had a meal together and then walked to Waverley Station, where Kenneth was to get a train to Glasgow and then to Gourock. When Mary and Kenneth reached the carriage in Edinburgh, he boarded the train, opened the window and said to Mary, I don't know if I am going to come back, but will you make sure you look after the child? John, Kenneth's son, was 1 year old. And another interesting anecdote was that Alec MacLeod from Waternish, literally a next door neighbour of David and who served in the Northern Gem, a rescue ship, he met David, and speaking to his brother William a number of years ago, he told me that Alec, David's good friend from Waternish, had met David possibly in Gourock before the convoy sailed, and he said, "Cha Till Mise in Turrishaw, I won't return this time." And that was the title of my Gaelic book, and that was why. And there was this pervading sense of foreboding, because there had been a number of convoys which had been on the receiving end of some quite heavy damage, and I think a lot of people felt this way. Another person of interest in the book is this man. I mentioned the sons. This was Fred Bean, and when I made contact with the sons, they were very helpful in giving me information, and he was one of the 3 radar operators in HMS Achates, and we can read a little excerpt about this in a second. You'll notice that the radar cabin is highlighted here, and Fred called it the caboose, where the 3 radar operators were, and it was just behind the bridge on HMS Achates. I'm going to read out Fred Bean's account of events. So there were 3 radar operators in the caboose, as they called their radar cabin above the bridge. Fred Bean from London, Ivor Rowe from Manchester, and David MacDonald from Waternish in the Isle of Skye. Fred Bean wrote down his recollections for his family. The first 3 shells missed, but the 4th exploded just on our port side, and that is when I caught my packet. I was operator on the RDF. I was passing to the bridge ranges and bearings of Jerry. Then out went all the lights. There was a terrific splash. I felt something go into my right shoulder and hand. There was also another RDF rating with me, which would have been David MacDonald, and he had his stomach grazed. And also Ivor, the wireless mic, a piece caught his ear. Those 2 went down below, and that was the last I saw of them. I went out on the bridge to be treated by the medical officer, but I felt faint through loss of blood, and I was taken to the captain's sea cabin just under the bridge, and there I remained. The medical officer injected morphine into me, and that put me to sleep. Interestingly, in this account, Fred Bean used a euphemism or 2 and did not tell things exactly as they were, and little wonder. Speaking to Fred's widow and his 2 sons in 2013, the author heard more details of what actually happened to the 2 others. Ivor was to one side of Fred, and when the shrapnel sprayed into the caboose, a piece hit Ivor, but it did not hit his ear, but his head, and decapitated him. He was killed instantly. Another piece hit Fred on the back of his shoulder, badly wounding him. Another shard hit David MacDonald in the stomach, and it was fatal. He died immediately, along with Ivor. All through his life, Fred had to have his wound cleaned, a wound which never healed properly. David Bean, Fred's son, added to his father's written account. I was told by my father that all 3 radar operators were on watch at the start of the enemy engagement. My father told me that he was working the very latest invention, the radar RDF 275. He said the radar was so sensitive he could not only see the Admiral Hipper, but also the huge shells being fired from it. After a few salvos, the Hipper got the Achates range. I remember my father's exact words. They were BSTRDS, they were deadly accurate. By the time they had finished with us, our ship was like a pepper pot. My father then saw a shell fired from the Hipper that was on direct course for the Achates. My father contacted the captain and informed him. Seconds later, the shell landed. It was a direct hit that destroyed the bridge and killed everybody there. I'm sorry to say that same shell killed the 2 radar operators sitting next to my father. And from other sources, it's recorded that was at 11:15 on the morning of 31st December 1942. So our family knew exactly what had happened to David. The next picture shows Alec MacLeod. He was, as I've mentioned already, a close friend and immediate next door neighbour to David in Waternish, Isle of Skye. He served on the rescue ship HMT Northern Gem. I spoke to Alec's brother, William, in Portree, as I mentioned, and he also told me that his brother never spoke about the incident because the Northern Gem was the ship that rescued, the only ship that rescued survivors from HMS Achates. And Alec would have known that David, his best good friend, was on that ship. And his brother William in Portree, in about 2012, I think it was, 2013, said to me that he had tried a number of times to find out from Alec what happened that night, and he wouldn't tell him. He just shut up. He never said a thing. I also spoke a few years ago to the local minister at the church, Reverend Murdo MacLeod, and he said he had tried to get something from Alec about that night, and he said he would not say anything at all about it. So obviously it was something that was so traumatic that Alec did not want to see it. And you can understand if your good friend was on a ship that went down and you know that he wasn't among the survivors because all the survivors came on the Northern Gem. So there were plenty of traumatic, a number of people no doubt would be in the same situation, not wanting to speak about the experiences that they had seen in wartime. But there was somebody who did record what happened on that night, on the 31st of December 1942, and he's S.A. Kerslake. And you can actually read it for yourself. It's a piece called Coxswain on the Northern Convoys, and you can get it on the internet. If you type in S.A. Kerslake Coxswain in the Northern Convoys, you'll get quite an interesting read about his experiences. I'm going to read some of that just now because it's quite detailed and quite harrowing just to hear what he had to say about that event. So the Achates had gone beyond the point of no return. It turned on its side and it was sinking, going down. And the men were on the hull, just waiting to jump at the last moment. When the men from the Achates hit the water, with the red lights on their life jackets activated, the rescuers on the Northern Gem could see a myriad will-o'-the-wisps bobbing amongst the white caps of the Barents Sea. Here and there were stronger white lights from the Carley floats. It was like a scene from a perverse winter fairyland. Kerslake, coxswain of the rescue ship, succeeded in hauling one survivor on board. He saw another man, a young lad, drifting past the stern of the boat, with his hand outstretched, looking for a rope, which he hoped someone would throw to him. Kerslake threw one, and the rope fell over the shoulders of the young lad, but the young man was benumbed, and he could not feel the rope on his shoulders. Kerslake shouted at him to get a hold of the rope, but he could not move his arms. Next, Kerslake tried to loop the rope around the boy's shoulders, but he did not succeed. In his final moments, Kerslake heard the boy crying out for his mother, and the word mother was the last utterance Kerslake heard from the boy before he drowned. Kerslake himself wept through frustration and helplessness. Following this event, he recorded what happened next. Just at that precise moment, there was a terrific underwater explosion, and the northern gem was lifted bodily out of the water. The surface of the sea shivered for a few moments, then burst into a boiling cauldron of confused froth. When it returned to its former state, there was no one left alive in the water. There were probably 6 or 8 bodies floating past, still with their life jackets on which glowed the red lights. But there was no sign of any life. They had either been killed by the explosion or had succumbed to the frightful cold of the water. Our CO then thought it wise to go on to full speed and to catch up with the convoy, as the German surface vessels, as far as he knew, were still lurking in the area, and the gem wasn't built to fight a ship-to-ship battle of that sort. So that was S.A. Kerslake's account of the event. There were 83 personnel pulled out of the water, rescued from the Achates, out of a crew of 193. This might be a wee bit variance in figures that some people have given, but I think that's about right. One of the 83 died during the night, so that increased the casualty rate to 111. And as we close, we're going to mention this man, Loftus Peyton Jones. And he was 24 years of age, and he was the first lieutenant on the boat. The shell that hit the bridge killed the captain, H.T. Johns, and he had to take command. And he was commended for his actions because the Achates' role was to keep making smoke and to hide the convoy from the German vessels. And he continued doing that despite the ship having been shelled and hit so badly. And this picture was taken about a month or two after the Achates went down, and I think you can see the poignancy in his face. It is a picture which tells a story, I think. He was a man well respected by the crew. He was a compassionate man, and we managed to get the letter he wrote to David MacDonald's mother, and also the letter he wrote to Kenneth McKeever's widow, which I think I'll take time to read them because it's worth doing so. I'm going to read it from page in the book here because it's a wee bit clearer, if I can. So this is to David's mother. Dear Mrs. MacDonald, I am writing on behalf of the surviving officers and men of HMS Achates to tender you our heartfelt sympathy on the loss of your son and our shipmate, able seaman David MacDonald, who so gallantly gave his life in action against the enemy on 31st December 1942. He had, as you know, been with us since the beginning of the commission and had become one of the most popular and dependable members of the ship's company. It was therefore with very deep regret that we found him to be amongst those missing. Throughout the action, he played his part manfully and well, and remained at his post to the end. You may well feel very proud of him. If ever in the future I can be of any assistance to you, please do not hesitate to let me know. I shall be only too glad to do anything I can. Yours very sincerely, L.E. Peyton Jones, Lieutenant R.N. And the letter he wrote to Kenneth McKeever's widow. Dear Mrs. McKeever, I am writing on behalf of the surviving officers and men of HMS Achates to tender you our heartfelt sympathy on the loss of your husband and our shipmate, able seaman Kenneth McKeever, who so gallantly gave his life in action against the enemy on 31st December 1942. He had, as you know, been with us since the beginning of the commission and had become an indispensable member of the ship's company. It was therefore with very deep regret that we found him to be amongst the missing. Throughout the action, he worked unceasingly, entirely regardless of his own safety, and I cannot speak too highly of him, of his example of courageous devotion to duty which he set his shipmates. He was indeed a man among men, and you may well feel most proud of him. If ever in the future I can be of any assistance to you, please do not hesitate to let me know. I shall be only too glad to do anything I can. Yours very sincerely, Lieutenant L.E. Peyton-Jones, Lieutenant R.N. And Kenneth McKeever was a worthy posthumous recipient of the Oak Leaf. He went below to bring up sailors who had been injured and couldn't manage themselves to get up onto deck. He took people to the first aid posts while there was flak shrapnel flying around. And Peyton-Jones did mention he saw him just before the ship went down, but after that he didn't see him. He wasn't amongst those rescued, so must assume that he went down with the ship. Whatever way, we don't know. I'm going to leave the final word about HMS Achates with Lord Tovey. And he said about the Achates, this is a picture of the crew, not all of the crew. On the far side circled is Kenneth McKeever, Ian McKeever's father, and David here on the next row below him. We shall leave the final word with the Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Tovey. The Battle of the Barents Sea was one of the finest examples in either of the two world wars of how to handle destroyers and cruisers in action with heavier forces. Captain Sherbrooke saved his convoy by going straight in to attack his far heavier enemy, using his guns to do what damage they could, but relying on his torpedoes, the real menace to the heavy ships, to deter them from closing the convoy. Sherbrooke knew the threat was lost once his torpedoes were fired. When in position for firing, he turned his ships to simulate an attack. The mere threat was sufficient to persuade the enemy to break off their attack. As Sherbrooke went into attack, the Commodore turned his convoy away, and it was quickly covered by smoke from the Achates. Throughout the action, the Commodore handled his convoy with great skill. Smoke laying may not appear a very exciting way of fighting, but I know few things more unpleasant than being fired at when you cannot shoot back. Apart from preventing the enemy getting a sight of the convoy, there is always the chance of a torpedo attack developing out of the smoke. The sinking of the smoke layer is essential if the enemy is to get a chance of damaging the convoy, and the Achates was constantly coming under fire, but she stuck to her job right up to the time she sank. Truly a noble little ship and company. Thank you.
Should we take a little seat?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
So it's not me that's going to interview Patty, but we'd like to take some questions from the floor. Thank you very much, first of all, for that talk. It's fascinating. It's always really poignant to hear individual stories like that. Mm-hmm. So, questions?
83 were taken to off the Achates. One of them died, so during the night.
Did the Navy ever supply special winter clothing?
Oh yes, yes, there was special clothing as far as I understand. They needed it because of the extreme cold. And I know that the rescue ship did electric blankets to wrap around those who were rescued, because they would be 15 minutes in the water apparently and you were dead. It was so cold, and therefore they were supplied by the rescue ships were supplied with electric blankets. And I think, if I remember correctly, a lot of the stuff was paid for by voluntary associations, you know, to the clothing and so on, for people who had been rescued. They needed to get changed out of wet, cold clothing, and I don't think the Navy supplied that. It was voluntary associations.
And if the clothing got wet, did they have dry stuff to put on?
Well, that's what I'm saying, that as far as I remember, there would be charities at home who would provide clothing for shipwrecked sailors so that they could change into warm, dry clothing once they were rescued. They had to be dried and rubbed down so that their limbs could get some circulation going again, and then put into dry, warm clothing. Yes?
Yeah. Well, did that ship or others, were the crews pretty much stable over 2 or 3 years if they kept going that long? So, like, you know, that was the ship's third convoy duty, and would that mean that probably almost everybody in the crew had been on the previous two? Do you
Yeah,
know what I mean?
as far as I understand, yes. Yeah, there were.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting point you've raised, because I know in the rescue ships, the captains were very keen to maintain a good crew, and the rescue ships were recognised as being a type of ship where the crew kept it spick and span, and especially sailors from the islands, because they would have had good sea experience and knew how to handle lifeboats and so on. So a good crew was essential in the rescue ships. And as far as I know, for example, the Achates, it would have been more or less the same crew over the period, yeah. Because David was in the Achates since April 1942 right up into December when it was sunk, and so would Kenneth McKeever and others. Yeah.
You said in part that Stalin and Hitler had agreed to separate Poland
Yes,
into pieces.
yes.
In actual fact, the Soviet troops were in occupation in part of Poland at least 6 weeks before Britain declared war.
Right.
We declared war when the Germans invaded.
They did.
But the Soviets are already in Poland.
Well, thank you for that.
So,
Yeah. And yet, yeah, there wasn't any complaint about that, was there? No.
and of course, he was trying to play both sides.
Yes. And I think Churchill
Yeah.
did not like him as a man,
No.
but
no.
he was a statesman, and he could see
I mean, we see the same thing again of a president being taken in by the Russians, as Roosevelt was taken in, and we see it happening now.
Yeah.
Looking at the news, you would almost think that Ukraine declared war on Russia. Crazy.
So the ship was laying smoke to hide the convoy.
Yeah.
So was their radar not up to the same standard as our radar to find them in amongst the smoke?
I think they had received an order only to use radar every so often. It wasn't switched on all the time.
Meant the enemy.
The enemy, I mean, yes, the German. They didn't. I can't remember exactly the reason why, but it wasn't on all the time. And also that reminds me of the fact that Hitler had spooked his German navy. He had ranted and raved back home in Germany about them. He's saying that the Royal Navy was far better, and that they could travel up and down the Mediterranean undisputed, while our ships are lying at anchor in the forge, stuck in the forge in Norway. And after this battle, he was so infuriated that he wanted to dismantle his navy and use the guns on land and use the steel of the big battle cruisers for other military purposes, but his admirals persuaded him it wasn't a worthwhile thing, and the navy escaped. Yeah.
They dug a submarine up in the Channel. near Isle of Wight recently,
Right.
not long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And if Germany had been in full production, they've got 6 of them on the stock,
Yeah.
we would have been in serious trouble,
Yeah.
because these were virtually undetectable
Right.
by radar.
Okay.
They covered the whole surface in reflective rubber sheets.
Well.
And the only reason we found out about it was one had made an approach from Portland Bill,
Right.
and we had put in a new minefield there. Which the Germans didn't realise, it's only been there a fortnight,
Uh-huh.
and it took the bow end off this new
Right.
field.
Okay.
And it was recovered, I think, last year.
Right. Okay. Thank
But
you.
their technology was pretty
Yeah, there were.
good.
Yeah, there are a lot of things on the go. Yeah.
I mean, radar as it was when I was with attached to 296 signal sheet
Uh-huh.
was still being developed in 1957. The Marconi and various people were still working on the development
Of it. Yeah.
of advanced radar,
Yeah.
because we were using RDF wagons for fixing the position of aircraft.
Right.
So you had 6 RDF wagons on the airfield. They would pick up a plot from an aircraft, try to estimate the speed, and the second one would do the same. And by cross coordination of these RDF signals, would try to get a fix on the
Yeah.
aircraft.
Yeah.
That was, and the leading exponents of that, of course, were the Dutch.
Right.
And most of their operators were trained by Philips
Mm-hmm.
in Eindhoven.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Marina.
From your research, a lot of these men never spoke about their experiences. Would you say that was because they were under the Official Secrets Act, or because they were so traumatised that they just couldn't
Yeah.
revisit it until many, many years later, if at all?
I think it was because they were so traumatised. That, for example, Alec MacLeod, he had seen his good friend go down and couldn't help him. He would no doubt have been looking for him, knew he wasn't amongst the survivors. So it was a personal loss to him. And yeah, but I think we know it's generally true that a lot of people do not speak about. Some do, yeah, but many don't.
And I follow on from that, did their families get help after the passing of their
Yes,
loved
well,
ones?
we actually,
Practical.
Davina, my cousin, and myself, she'd been looking for years for papers relating to David, and she knew they were in her granny's kist at the top of the stairs, but any time she tried to get in there, her granny would tell her, don't go near these. And then the granny died and the papers were lost and she didn't know where they went. But her cousin Alan MacDonald, the late Alan MacDonald, whose mother was an aunt of Davina, we understood then, she had got the papers, and Alan, her son, gave them to us because he heard we were doing the research. And the mother, David's mother, was trying to get some help from the government because she was widowed and in a hard case, but she didn't get any help. Yeah, it was quite sad. Yeah.
I think merchant navy seamen, the minute their boat went down,
Yeah,
their pay stopped.
that's right, because the contract was
At first, but not all the way through.
not all the way through. No. Uh-huh.
Very early on it was happening.
Yeah, because it was dependent on their completing the round trip, wasn't it? And if they didn't complete it, then their pay stopped. It seemed quite hard.
I know the Japanese prisoners of war got no compensation at all,
Do they not? No. Well,
because there were 2.5 villages that got nothing.
yeah. So, do you know what happened later? They did get.
Yes. I don't remember the details, but after a couple of years of the war. Well, the ship owners had no money, the ship had gone.
Yes.
They had nothing to pay the survivors with,
Mm-hmm.
if there were survivors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Later on, there was a British government fund set up to pay survivors.
Right. Yeah. It did seem a cruel.
First, when the ship sank, it was pay stopped.
Yeah.
I'm going to permit myself the last question because I think it's probably about time to draw a close. But I'd like to know did David have any experience as a seaman before he joined up? And was Achates the only ship he ever sailed on?
I think Achates was the first ship he sailed on. He came from training, as far as I understand, to the Achates.
Was he an experienced seaman in the islands? I mean, when he was
yeah,
growing
well,
up,
he was brought up in Waternish, and he would not have been in the merchant navy or anything like that, but they would have been going out fishing, and he would have had experience of boats. And I know Alec and his brother William fished a lot in Waternish, and I'm sure David would have as well. My own grandfather, who had Waternish connections as well, he actually rescued someone from drowning in the loch there. So they would, I mean, they would have had a fair experience of the local area if they hadn't been to sea anyway. But it's a bit of a different game, isn't it, being on the oceans. But no, as far as I know, he wasn't an experienced seaman as such. No. One last anecdote. I didn't have time to mention it in the thing, but Commodore Melhuish, he had to deal with all sorts of situations, and on Convoy JW51B, a fight broke out in the midst of a storm. A group of stokers who had been offered £100 if they sailed on a Russian convoy got drunk, and these stokers were prisoners from Barlinnie. And the government were offering £100 to prisoners to go in the convoy because there was a need. And a fight broke out. People were stabbed. They'd broken into a container which had rum rations for I think it was a mine sweeper in Murmansk. They were waiting for the rum to come, but I assume they were Glaswegians, drank it. And not only that, there was a train bound for Russia shackled on the deck of the cargo boat, and it broke loose, so they had to deal with that. And when they got to Murmansk, some of the sailors who had been wounded in the fight were put on a train, and they were attacked by German ski troops. So they had quite an experience. They managed to get through that safely, and so there are all sorts of things happening on the convoys.
Sounds like it, yeah. Well, thank you, Roddy. And at this point, I think we'd say good night to our remote audience. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you again. And